way, Mr. Smith, T. Dan Smith, was making a point which I think is important that we actually recap, and it was simply that that if Masonry is some kind of declared interest, why shouldn't this interest actually be stated? Why does it have to be so secret? Why isn't there a public list of members of the different lodges? And you were going to tell us an anecdote.
Yes, I was really following up the point you were making, that I got a call one evening.
While you're doing that, could you also explain, if you've got to declare an interest in Masonry, which anybody can apply to join, why don't you include a list of all those who belong to the local Chamber of Commerce?
Because they have no power.
You'll excuse me, and they have to be invited to join.
They do not take an oath of mutual obligation, which is the case.
In commerce, they
don't actually take an oath of mutual obligation.
You're not going to tell me that their liaison isn't as close.
Well, it actually isn't written into the rules. That's all. The only difference I'm making.
Lots of women take an oath to honour and obey. Well, I used to. I must say a few of those slip back.
But I think that no one can deny that the powerful Masonic lodges have a lot of power and influence by definition because of the people who are members of them. But what I was going to say, and this is from my own experience, that I was called up one Saturday evening by a gentleman who said, "You don't know me, but you might remember some circumstances." And he outlined the circumstances, and I said to him, "Well, you may be surprised to know that, in fact, I know from someone else that you're an MI5 man." Now, I knew that. He came to see me, and there were two reasons for him coming. One was a personal reason in relation to his son. I won't mention the name because his son is now quite an eminent person. And the other one was to tell me that there was a conspiracy taking place which became the Cruden affair in Newcastle. He named the people, and there were 4 of them who were Masons on both sides of the council, 2 of them who were my colleagues. And he said, if I were you, I would keep away from the debates where Crudens are attending. He told me where the meeting was, when the meeting was, and I checked that out, and sure enough the people were there. And I never did attend a single meeting when Crudens was discussed, but it didn't stop the affair. And when I confronted my 2 colleagues and said, what are you doing with 2 members of the opposition attacking what I was then the leader of the council, he could produce no answer. Now, I'm not saying that it was because he was a Mason or the others were Masons, but it was a coincidence that they were meeting and they had in common the removal of me by one means or another. Now, the other point was that when I went to prison, I had many people who thought I was a Mason, but of course, obviously the Masons knew that I wasn't a Mason. The 2 that I'm talking about knew that I wasn't a Mason. But I knew the handshake, because so many people that didn't know I was a Mason used to give it to me. And so I used to, as best I could, give it back. Now, I did that because I don't like secret societies.
But how does the handshake actually work?
Well, I mean, the way that I got it, one of your colleagues gave it to me when I came in. Whether he was kidding me or not, I don't know. But I mentioned that because the fact of the matter is that happened to me tonight. Now, he may have been kidding me because he knew that I wasn't.
Or did that feel like the right handshake to you, Martin?
No, I think he gave me the second-degree handshake.
Yeah.
Depends on which knuckle you get the pressure.
Okay. So
but it was sufficient to indicate, and I could have done. There are 2 handshakes that I was picked up as I understood them, and I was going into a prison when one of the officers gave me the Masonic handshake.
Do officers always shake hands with prisoners when they come in?
Pardon?
Do officers, is this a habit?
Never.
They say, welcome,
never.
you know.
Never, ever.
I'm just asking the
But
police.
nevertheless, I got that Masonic handshake, and then the chaplain of the particular prison gave me the Masonic handshake, and then I was invited to a meeting in the church in the prison.
The prison chaplain?
By the prison chaplain. And it was a Masonic meeting. Now, there's no way that you can tell me that didn't take place, because it did take place. And when I got there, you can appreciate I didn't last very long. It was looked upon as a dreadful thing to do. Now, if I can just put this little aside, I had tried to get that same hall to set up a group of Alcoholics Anonymous. Not that I had the problem, but I felt it was a worthwhile prison activity, and I couldn't get the use of the hall for that purpose. Now, I know that the people that they're prisoners and officers, and the chaplain, therefore were Masons. If there was no special significance in the Masonic connection, not only in the council, but between prison officer, chaplain, and prisoners, then it seemed a strange thing to me. Now, that actually happened. And I don't say they were discussing parole, I don't say they were discussing anything of significance, but they had that unity, and they had that ability to meet. Now then, if I can just...
Is it corrupt if they meet for worship
it's
on
not
Sundays?
It's not a question. It's not a question of corruption. It's a question that they could do it.
But yes, but you're suggesting all sorts of ulterior motives.
I'm not.
If they were having a lodge, if they were, and I've no idea whether lodges meet in prisons or not. Perhaps you know.
No, I
Perhaps
know.
they meet in Holloway. I don't
I
know.
think I ought
but
to object
I mean,
and say
if
I'm
they
not here
were,
to
you
defend men
you know,
Masons.
you were, you know, this innuendo, this hint.
Well, no other organisation that I met, and I was in 18 prisons, could have had that meeting. They had that meeting
Why
because
do you say
they...
that? Why do you say that?
Pardon?
Why do you say that?
Why do I say...
What's your evidence for that? Why do you say no other organisation could have... I mean,
Because there would
that's a
be
very
no
bold
means of
assertion.
communication. No,
No, because
specialist...
you're going backwards, aren't you?
The curate couldn't have been enough. You couldn't have had a meeting of the RIBA because the curate couldn't have been one. The prison officers couldn't
But
be.
how do you know that? You're
Because
assuming
they
that.
couldn't be.
How do you know it? You don't
Because
know.
the prison officer wouldn't be an architect, else he wouldn't have been a prison officer. The kind of grouping that the Masons had was that they have a means of connecting each other simply by a handshake. So that, but yes, they could go into prison and those men knew that they were Masons. And there's no doubt of that at all. They were going to have a Masonic meeting at which I could have been there.
But
Except
how
that I
do you know?
couldn't go.
Yeah. How do you know?
Because I was there.
What happened?
Well, what
I was
benefits...
there.
They thought...
If I
what
could have
happened
gone
in
on
the
with the
meeting?
procedure, which I couldn't.
They thought
I
you
was
were a
actually
Mason,
10
did they?
seconds left.
Because of the handshake, they thought you were a Mason.
They didn't think I was a Mason. They assumed I was because I was actually in the meeting. I
What
was
benefits
invited
did
to
you
the
get
meeting.
in prison following that?
Pardon?
What other benefits did you get in prison from them following that?
From them, none.
Yes.
I mean, I was
Well,
treated in a hostile manner.
if you were going to
They
get...
rapidly discovered that you weren't really a Mason.
Within seconds. Because they then got down to the business.
They probably assumed from the nature of your offence, in other words...
Well, Poulson affair was said to be
yes.
a matter for Masons.
Well,
Now, it's no good arguing. The men in that room were Masons, and they were Masons, and they had given the Masonic handshake given to me, and whether I gave it the right way or not, it was sufficient to get me invited there. It was on. You're on the square, Dan, or whatever the parson said to me.
May I ask you a question?
Don't
What's
wave at
what's
me. It's
puzzling
nothing to do with me.
is,
What may have happened in some badly run prison.
You mentioned something about procedure, and at some stage during that procedure they discovered you couldn't follow
I
them.
literally got in the door.
Well, why should they throw you out? How at that stage?
Because you asked me the detail now. The procedure that they began then took you to some other method of identification. And
So you could do the handshake, but you couldn't get much
that's
further
right.
within
I didn't know anything else at all.
But quite clearly it wasn't a formal Masonic lodge,
No.
because there are no lodges formally consecrated to meet within prisons, but what it might have been is some kind of gathering of Freemasons.
They were asking
and
each other what lodges they were
certainly,
in.
Dan would have been subjected to some
They
further
were
sign of
identifying themselves
recognition.
as to where they were.
I think
But
the question that perhaps the Canon and Sir David are sort of hinting at is that it's all very well, but I mean, what's so terrible about this?
Because you're getting a privilege in prison where there are not many privileges. If whatever you want,
You've
you
given no
assumption
evidence of
you're
any
making.
privilege. I mean, you said they met in the chapel, then you said it was the hall, so I don't know which it was you were talking about actually at that moment. But then what privilege did they get?
Well,
I mean,
the only-
I've gone in and conducted group discussions in prison with prisoners and prison officers. I've never refused the use of supercilices for this.
that you would get into prison for a specific service and be authorized to go in not because you're a Mason or
Exactly.
you weren't a Mason.
Exactly.
It's a privilege in the sense that
But you
if you
didn't-
like
you
the
haven't
church,
said-
the Catholic Church, the Methodist, they have organisations and you can attend them if you want, but they're known. They don't say, well, if you happen to have a particular handshake, you're in. They say if you believe in God and you're a Methodist, you go to the Methodist Church. That's perfectly
Does
straightforward.
it not occur to you as a possibility, just as a remote possibility, that the reason they weren't prepared to let you run something for Alcoholics Anonymous was because A, you weren't an alcoholic, B, you weren't anonymous, and C, you knew nothing about it?
That's very. I mean, that would be quite right. It could well be that. But if you can give me one good reason why any church in prison would not allow you to use the vestry for the purposes of helping alcoholic people whose main problem was alcoholism that got them into
They
crime.
may well have been prepared to do it. They just didn't think that T. Dan Smith, able as he is in so many other fields, was the best man to be dealing with Alcoholics Anonymous.
They didn't have to, but that didn't stop them letting me deal with a lot of other problems.
Well,
I
that's
set up a
exactly what
lot of
I'm saying.
associations
That
in
is
prison.
exactly what I'm saying.
Pardon?
That is exactly what I'm saying. You were able to deal with other problems.
Perhaps the meeting was to make aprons out of mailbags.
Well, I don't want to pursue that further. What I'm saying is that everyone there was a Mason.
I understand.
And they had the right, just by a handshake, to go from prisoner, prison officer, and meet as one congregation.
Let me draw us back to Brian's case. Brian, Sir David raised 2 or 3 fairly specific questions to you earlier on. They were that you had outlined a doubtless fascinating story, but there was absolutely no evidence in your story to connect the concept of Freemasonry and corruption